This is our second to last, and I'm so excited to be introducing the two patriarchs of the Tikkun, Moshe and Jeff. I'm going to give you some background on them, even though they probably don't want me to. Jeff Feig's passion for Jewish learning is evident from participation on the of the Marlene JCC Manhattan, the Shefa School, the Jewish Week, and JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary. He is an investor living in Manhattan with his wife Michelle and their three sons. He's actively involved in the Tikkun, which is named in memory of his mother. Moshe Horn is a former Manhattan district attorney. He is now a professor at Cardozo Law School and a criminal defense lawyer, specializing in Title IX work. Moshe is a frequent lecturer to high school and college students and parents on critical issues facing today's students. He's been on the Tikkun Plan Committee as well as a chief cookie baker, officer, let's say. Let's keep it in the corporate world. With Jeff for 20 years and is incredibly the Tikkun at the JCC. So excited. The scandals of the with the Tikkun patriarchs, Moshe and Jeff. Get away.
Thank you, Sarah.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. How's everyone doing? So, look, Moshe and I'm from Toronto. I met Moshe, about a year after I moved to New York. We eventually were in Fire Island houses together. We became very good friends. We went to shul together. We did some Jewish learning together. I think the idea, the genesis of this really, for me, comes to when we were at BJ for Shavuot, long before the JCC was doing a Tikkun. We were doing it at synagogue we go to, BJ. And whatever teacher starts telling the story of Tamar. Now, I went to day school in Toronto through ninth grade, Associated Hebrew Day School. Moshe, where did you go to school?
I went to Salman Schefter in New Jersey.
Right through.
All the way through.
All the way through. And we're listening to the story of Tamar. And as I'm going to tell when we go through it, it's right in the heart of Genesis. And I think, at Associated Hebrew Day School, I learned Genesis 3 times, right? In three different grades. And I'd never heard this story. Moshe and I always talked about like all these amazing stories that we never learned in day school. And they're so interesting. And in fact, one of the things we often talked about is we got such a polished version of the Torah. Everybody, was either good or evil, right? Moses good, Pharaoh evil. Characters were flawless. I remember, learning about Abraham and the Akedah. And Abraham did everything right. God told him to go kill his son. So of course he's going to go kill his son. That's what a good person does. And then God says, oh no, don't kill him. So he doesn't kill him. We never learned the complexity. And I think it wasn't just us. I think it's a lot of people. And it struck me when you told me the story about the time you were at a Beit Din at around Father's Day.
Yeah. So first of all, Chag Sameach. Thanks for everybody for staying up. I can't believe you're all here with us at 3:30 in the morning, which is awesome. And just to steal 2 minutes here, I have to tell you, one of my favorite nights of the year is the Tikkun. And I think it's an amazing thing that the Manhattan JCC does for everyone, and that Jeff in particular has taken this on to honor his brother. And I can tell you, I knew his brother, and his brother Paul would have loved the Tikkun. He would have loved the music and the arts, and he would have loved so many different kinds of people getting together under one roof, or this year computer together, just learning, because Paul was a Renaissance man. I think he would have loved tonight. So I think the fact that Jeff does this every year, JCC does that, is a highlight.
Let me just interrupt. I just want to recognize
you can't even let me get in like
sorry.
It's unbelievable.
My sister-in-law Paula is on the Zoom, and she stayed up to 3:30, and she always tends the Tikkun. They had a wonderful marriage, and it's a testament that not only is she still close to me, even though she's remarried and has 2 kids who we're all very close to, but God, she sees my parents, or my mom now, more than I do.
So anyway, it's an amazing night. So thank you all for staying up till almost near the end with us. So I can tell you, I have vivid memories of being young and studying Noah in Solomon Schechter, and literally the teacher saying, okay, everybody, we're going to skip the next parak. I literally remember it. And I remember not knowing what was in that parak and being curious, like, why did we just skip it over? I remember skipping over this section with Dina. And I remember we didn't know. And literally they would say, okay, turn the next 10 pages. So what Jeff was referring to is a couple of years ago, I actually appeared as a lawyer in an ultra-Orthodox Beit Din in Brooklyn, which is an amazing story. Maybe one year I'll teach you the Tikkun, because I had to present to an ultra-Orthodox panel, which was very difficult. And I defended a criminal in there. Anyway, I got there early. And the panel, which was 3 Haredi rabbis who were considered very learned, were all discussing amongst themselves, just waiting about what would happen. I still remember this. They were debating what would happen if a tzaddik prayed to God really hard for a sin. Would God listen to his prayers? And they were talking about how, God may listen or may not, but, everyone can have some kind of sin. And then I actually couldn't help myself. I joined in the conversation and I said, isn't that part of what makes our whole tradition so rich, that even our patriarchs in the Bible were flawed and committed sins themselves? And they literally looked at me with serious hostility, which probably didn't help my client at all. And they said, Alavai, we should all be such sinners as the patriarchs, the Avot in the Bible. And they glared at me. And I said, but you can't defend everything there.
Halavai, it's one of my favorite
words. Literally,
but...
Halavai, like, oh my God, we should all be so lucky to be sinners like them. And I said, so I threw out a couple of the stories Jeff's going to talk about in a minute. I said, but you guys admit that, like, those aren't such good things. And they literally looked at me, and the chief judge looked at me with ice in his voice and went, we don't speak of such things. Alavai, we should be such sinners. And he ended it. And I thought I had really screwed my client. So, and that's a true story. And I remember about telling Jeff and said, it's really amazing. And then there was one other Shabbos dinner Jeff and I were at where this topic came up, and we had 2 of our friends there who were born in yeshiva, and we were talking all about these stories. And one of our friends looked and she goes, why are you guys making all this up? None of this happened. And we're like, what are you talking about? Of course it happened.
Just for the record, that's our friend Beth.
Yeah, I'm trying to be good here and not
and our
her,
friend
but,
Stan. Right.
And it's true story. She goes, you're making this up. And we said, no, we're not. And literally we had to get out the Bible and show her the stories. And she literally was like, no one ever told us this. And that's the origin of how we decided to start talking about some of these issues, which frankly, I think are pretty interesting, pretty amazing stories.
And I think when you start to learn these stories that, again, we never learned in day school, and start to appreciate the complexity that the Torah brings to us. And because the characters have more depth and are more interesting and are richer, you start to see the lessons that you're learning in their behavior and who does what. And I think it just brings richness and relevance to the Torah. And that's one of the reasons why we want to.
And if we do this well in 50 minutes, you'll agree with us.
Right. And so, these are, we're going to talk about 3/4 stories, and they're awful stories. I mean, this is misogyny. They're all right. They're all.
It's not good.
They're all misogyny. There's rape. There's killing. It's awful stories. But they're in the Torah. They're in the Tanakh, and you learn a lot. And I'm going to start with the story of Tamar. Again, the story, and that begins. It's in Genesis. It's right there. We must have skipped over it all 3 times that I learned it in day school. And it begins, if you know the story of Joseph, right after the brothers left him in the pit and he was sold to the Ishmaelites. This story begins. It's I think three prakim, and then it ends, and the story of Joseph continues with the story of Potiphar, which one of our earlier speakers today, Elisha Wiesel, spoke about when he was teaching us Daf Yomi. And the story of Joseph continues as if this never happened. And this I've learned this a few times, but the last time was part of the Wexner class I took. It was taught by Arna Pupko, a wonderful teacher who now lives in Cincinnati. And her take on it, I thought, was the most interesting and relevant take. And as we go through it, I think, what I want you to think about is, why is this story right in the middle of the story of Joseph? So I'm going to share the screen, and so we can look at the text.
And it didn't make it into the Broadway musical.
It's true. It was not in the Broadway musical. All right. Sarah, can everyone see the text? Sarah, you want to give me a thumbs up if it's working? Yeah, all right, great. All right, so I'll read it. About the time Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite, whose name was Shua. He married her, cohabited with her. She conceived and bore a son, named him Or. She conceived again, bore a second son named Onan. Once again, she bore a son named Shelah. He was a chazib. Don't really know what that means. When she bore him, Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his life. Son 1, dead. Then Judah said to Onan, his second son, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. Right? This is a Jewish tradition that, the law still exists today. When my brother died, there's actually a ceremony that you can perform called chalitza. If your brother-in-law doesn't want to marry you and you're the widow, and we have to go, my sister-in-law Paula and I had to go through a form of that chalitza, but it's a pretty ugly ceremony. But anyways, Judah said to Onan, you've got this responsibility. Join with your wife's brother and do your duty as your brother-in-law, provide her offspring for your brother. Onan, knowing that his seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined his brother's wife, meaning he did it multiple times, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. Now, Moshe and I were chatting with our good friend and one of our best teachers, David Hoffman, the Honey for Israel Foundation, formerly the vice chancellor of JTFs. And he had a really good thought about this. So this idea of spilling your seed, does that really get you killed? Is that big a deal? And what David pointed out is it's not the spilling the seed. It's that he deceived Tamar. He knowingly slept with her time and time again. So he was enjoying having sex with his brother's widow, but he had no intention of doing what he was supposed to do. He was just having fun. I mean, if he didn't want to give her a seed, he could have just not slept with her, but he didn't do that. And David's explanation, which I think is excellent and a great lesson, is it's that dishonesty and taking advantage of woman that got son number 2 killed. So now Judah says to his daughter-in-law Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, because he thought, I don't want him to die like his brothers died. A long time afterwards, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died, and when his period of his mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah with a friend of his, a Adulamite. And Tamar was told, hey, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for shear herding. Meanwhile, just understand, Tamar has been living in her father's house, a widow, no family, no money, no inheritance, nothing, right? A totally miserable life. And so what does she do? She took off her widow's garb, which she was still wearing, covered her face with a veil, wrapping herself up, sat down, and she stood at the entrance to the gate. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, a hooker, a prostitute, because she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the side of the road and he said, here, let me sleep with you. And he said, not realizing that it was Tamar. What, she asked, will you pay me for sleeping with me? He replied, I will send a kid from my flock. But she said, you must leave a pledge until you have sent it. He said, what pledge should I give you? What do I have? She said, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and put on her widow's garb. So now Judah sent the kid to redeem the pledge, but no one could find her because there's no hooker. It was really the widow. He inquired of the townspeople, where is the cult prostitute? They all replied, there's been no prostitute here. So his friend returns to Judah and says, I could not find her. Moreover, the townspeople said there's been no prostitute. Judah said, fine, let her keep my stuff, lest we become a laughing stock. I did not send her the kid, and you did not find her. 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. So he doesn't realize that when they say she played it, it was with him. And so he says, bring her out, let her be burned. And as she was being brought out, she sent the message to her father-in-law. I am with child by a man who this belonged. And she said, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? And Judah recognized him, and the English translation says, she is more right than I, inasmuch as that I did not give her to my son Shelah. But if I look at the Hebrew, it's a key line. Vayomar, Tzadka bimeni. He said, she is more righteous than I am.
Which is very different.
Right. And Tzadka mimeni, like she is the righteous one. I am not. And the way Arna taught this is a key moment for Judah. He was not intimate with her again. When it came time for her to give birth, she had twins. She named them, and they became part of the tribe of Israel, and she became part of the tribe of Israel. And as you can see, they were named Zerah and Perez. And so what happens, and why is this so important? Why is this story there?
But just to give one example, if you would ask me and Jeff when we were seniors in high school, and I took some of these classes in college, if someone had said to you, is there prostitution in the Torah, what would you have said?
No, there's no prostitution.
Exactly.
Right. And
my Orthodox teachers would have been like, they were like, don't ask such questions. Like, what's wrong with you? So this is an example of how we just never saw this stuff.
And here's the great thing about this story. Tamar is the hero.
Right.
And why is the story in the middle? Because Judah was the one who said to throw Joseph in the pit. When we go, and I'm not going to go, the text is here, that anyone can look at it later. But when you go read the story of Joseph, Judah is the one who makes the case of being willing to sacrifice his life for Benjamin. He's the one who kind of softens Joseph and makes Joseph realize that his brothers have actually turned and they're actually good. And that's when, and Joseph, of course, is this hugely important character, totally respected by the Egyptians. And this is the beginning of the story of the Exodus. And what Arna taught and what I believe is that the reason this story is right here, right in the middle of the story of Joseph, is because it shows you how important this woman is. We have a heroic woman, Tamar, who acts in a just way under terrible circumstances and winds up being the one to change Judah and therefore enable the rest of the Torah to happen.
Right. So the irony is it's misogynistic, but it's actually also a feminist story. It's an interesting mix. And that's true in the story of Dina, we'll get to in a few minutes later. It's such an interesting mix because it's horrible, it's brutal, it's wrong, but it actually brings this incredible, powerful image of this woman who finds herself and actually is very strong. For her to say, you have to leave your stuff with me, when you think about it.
And the thing is, nobody's really, not nobody, but it's so rare to get this interpretation. I was in Israel in Baka with my cousin Sim, and on their sukkah, his wife put up all the heroic women of the Torah, and I looked at it, and I said, "Where's Tamar?" She said, "Oh, Tamar?
Right.
Tamar isn't a hero."
Busha.
And I gave her this interpretation, and she just loved it. And so I hope that going forward, all of you who are watching this will help translate this and let Tamar be known and remembered and understood as one of the heroes of the Torah. Now we'll talk to someone who's had a very different experience, and that's Dina.
So this is an interesting story. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I think we're going to end up running out of time. But essentially, and this is really a harsh story, but there's so much here. So essentially, the story here is the tribes of Israel are coming. You can read it yourselves. But Jacob comes with his sons to Shechem, and he comes back to Israel, and he has his daughter Dina, and Dina and I want to show you one or two lines. Before I tell the story, I'm going to focus on, she goes out of her tents and she catches the eye of a local leader, Shem, who then takes her physically. He defiles her, as you can see in the Torah, and then he falls in love with her. And he comes with his family, and they come to Jacob and his sons and basically say, we want to marry her. And he falls in love with her after he's raped her. And he says, I'll give you property, I'll give you goods, I'll give you whatever you want. We're all going to become big family. And essentially, Jacob's first reaction is he waits for the sons to come back. His sons come back and they come up with this plan. And they basically say to him, yes, we'll do it, but first you have to agree to be circumcised. So the entire tribe agrees to be circumcised. And while they're healing from their circumcision and they're weak, the sons come in and take revenge for the rape, and they kill the entire tribe, all the men. And they take the women and they take property, and they come back to Jacob and they say, look what we've done. And this is one of the key. And so that's basically the story. And then Jacob says to them, look what you've done to me. You've made me at risk. I'll be a pariah. I'll be at risk. And the big line at the end is they say, at the end, they say, essentially, should our sister be treated like a whore, is that last line. So that's a short version of it. But I want to break down a couple of things for you. First of all, there's a couple of firsts with the story of Dinah. Number one, it's the first story that talks about how a sister should be treated. It's the first talks about how should brothers treat a sister. That's the first thing, which is an interesting way of looking at it, about how the brothers really want to revenge their sister, take care of their sister. They are clearly furious for her. So it shows this relationship.
Isn't she the first sister, right?
Yeah.
Abraham, we never learned about sisters. Isaac, we never learned about sisters, about daughters, right?
Right.
She just really comes out of nowhere.
So that's the first story about that. It's really the first morality play with a woman like this. So that's another take on it in terms of how should they respond to her being attacked. And then it's really the first revenge story. It's, this is all out blood revenge. Like, here's what happens to her. So, but here's the next layers of how you look at it. Number one, there were so many things they could have come up with to weaken the other tribe. They could have said, hypothetically, you want to marry our sister? Great. You have to fast for 5 days and cleanse yourselves. Or they could have said, you have to not drink water. Or they could have said, you have to give up your arms for 2 days to show, or whatever. But they chose circumcision, which is the covenant of the connection of the Jews to God, which is why boys are circumcised. And that, the commentators say, is it's a direct statement to say, this is tribal. We're going to use this symbol to weaken you, not fasting, nothing else. We are using our covenant, basically our badge as Jews to weaken you. And it's basically almost like a gang's tat. It's like saying, we're showing you who you messed with. And that's why a couple of commentators in a very bold way say this was actually, and I got this from the Lair House, which is a very good commentator's bunch of essays. They said this is actually the beginning of the people of Israel, because it's the first time they acted like a people and said, somebody messed with one of us, so now we're going to mess with all of you. So it's a very powerful statement saying, like, we're tribal. Another way to look at it too, which is interesting, is who do we not hear from in the story of Dinah? And people say there's two big silences. One is Dinah. We don't hear from her at all. And there are many, a lot of feminist scholarship that say this symbolizes how many rape victims are silenced in modern times, in fact, all times. And there's been a lot of scholarship on that, which is something interesting to think about, which I think makes it certainly relevant to modern times and something that should be taught. Other people say her silence was shame or it was courage. God was silent. There's no voice from God here. And there's a lot of God statements throughout the entire 5 books of the Torah where he says, like, or frankly, once you get into the prophets, even more so, where clearly God makes his feelings thought on what is and is not appropriate. Here, God says nothing. So we don't really know from that perspective, does God think the sons were right for honoring, in theory, God and the people of Israel? Does he think they were wrong? Does he think Jacob was wrong? We don't know. But God's silence is also something that's talked about a lot in this story. And a couple of other things which is interesting just to talk about is there a hero here? Is there not a hero here? And here's how it's broken down. Jacob's reaction at first to hear that his daughter has been defiled is really nothing. He waits. He waits for the sons to come back. And then when he finds out what the sons did, his reaction is, look what you've done to me. He doesn't say, you've killed people, how could you do that? He doesn't say, look what you've done to your sister. He doesn't say, it's a very narcissistic, look what you've done to me perspective. And then the sons have the final line, which is interesting. Their final line is, we're not going to let our sister be treated like that. And Jacob has no answer. So a lot of the scholars say, maybe they're the hero. They have the ultimate morality statement. And Jacob's silence there is very interesting. It's almost like he has no answer, because it's almost like they're saying, we're doing what you should have done. We're standing up for her when you should have. So there's all kinds of interesting ways of look at this on who's the hero, who really is the one who spoke up, who didn't speak up, what is the proper response. And there's also a couple of really interesting things to kick around, which is, if you look at the text, and I'm going to tell you, go to line, sorry, give me a second. First line, she went out to visit the daughters of the land. Fascinating phrase. It seems so benign, but once you dig into this, it has been played in so many ways. So there's an entire body of scholarship that actually blames Dinah for this. They say this was unchaste. Why did she leave her tent? They make it sound like she was going to look for men, or look for, go to show herself off from that perspective. So there's a lot of people who blame her for that. There's other people that say, which is interesting, and this is actually a Chabad perspective, which makes a lot of sense when you break it down. A lot of them have said this is actually the first, you're going to like this one, I think, the first purely social moment in the Bible. She doesn't go out to commit sacrifice, to perform a sacrifice, to pray, to feed, to do anything. Right? When Abraham's servant goes to the well, he's going to the well to get water and to meet them for his son-in-law, right? When Moses goes he's going to get water when he meets the women in Midian. This is just social. It's the first one, and one scholar said it's the only one. I can't prove that, but that's what he said. I saw it today, actually, something I read, which is really interesting. And one of the Chabad people said, this is such a great message, even if it led to horrible violence, because they said, at the end of the day, what is our mission as Jews? It's not just to sit in our homes and take care of ourselves. It's to go out and visit and see people and do mitzvot and visit people in their homes and take care of people and be present in the community. So from Chabad, it's to meet, to help other Jews, to go, to do kiruv and things like that. But that's their take on it. And but this to stop and think from that for a second, like, what a fascinating phrase, right? Just to say this is the first social, maybe the only social moment in the whole Torah, even if it led to disaster for her.
Right. How do you feel about the fact that it led to disaster? The only social moment.
Right. Which is right. You could view that as a total condemnation, right? Which is interesting, and it's true. And some people talk about that, and they say, well, why? Some people say, why was she going to socialize with the non-Jews, with the non-Jewish daughters? And some people are saying that it's a statement against assimilation. And the last thing I'll say is, and by the way, if anybody has any questions or whatever, you should just jump in here. Don't be shy.
We'll do it at the end.
Oh, or maybe not. Jeff just said. So this is what it's like teaching with Jeff. So anyway, but the other thing is, which is interesting, is there are some people say this is the ultimate statement of peoplehood and against assimilation, because this is something Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote about. You can make an argument that what Shechem's father does here is exactly what you would hope someone does in a horrible situation like this, right? His son did a horrible thing. Let's start with that. His son did a horrible thing. But what does he do? He comes and says, my son did this. I want to make it right. We're going to give you property. We're going to welcome in your daughter. We want to be family with you. We want to pay for this. Like, it doesn't make it right what happened, obviously, but it is what you would kind of hope to hear, right? From like the best he could possibly do. Well, he can't undo the rape, right? So you think it's like the best possible thing you can do. So how do they react? They're like, yeah. So what do? They basically go and commit mass murder. So some people say it's like the ultimate statement of, no, we will not assimilate. You are not us. This is how we react to assimilation. This is how we react to intermarriage. And it's no joke. So for some people, it's viewed as like the ultimate statement of peoplehood. So at the end of the day, it's a horrible story. This poor woman gets raped. She's never heard from again, except in some midrash she is, but in general, we don't really know much about her. She never gets to speak up for herself. She's treated like property. It's a horrible story, make no mistake about it. But again, as Jeff said in the beginning, and this is why I think both of us came to the conclusion that we should study these stories, is because look at all these amazing lessons you learn from this. Were the brothers heroes or not? It talks about how siblings should look out for each other. Jacob is seen as, I think, in many ways, a very selfish reaction. The way they used it as peoplehood and the covenant, and this whole concept of the fact that she went out and the social piece and just to see what happened, and whether it should be applauded or whether it should be condemned is a whole other story. But the fact that it happened is so interesting.
Let me ask you one question now. Is it possible that it was consensual? They never called it the rape of Tina, but
it's great that you say that. So there was a book a couple of years ago that was really popular called The Red Tent. I know Leslie loved it. I think a lot of it was very popular. I never read it, but in reading about the book, and maybe some people here have read it, apparently she describes it as a love affair and said it was consensual. And there are some scholars that say so. We'll never know. His reaction does seem to speak of it as consensual. As I don't know, but it's a great question. The last two things I'll tell you is this: is we in the end of when Jacob is dying, and he's giving the blessings to all his sons on his deathbed, he curses these two brothers who committed these murders. So a lot of people say that was his ultimate statement of morality on this action, and he did condemn it, and he did it. I don't know if it really means much. I think in some ways it's kind of really a weak thing to do when you wait that long and you do it to them on their deathbed when they can't defend themselves anymore. And he should have done it then and there. But that is an interesting statement. So I will just throw this in just from my own personal experience. I was once trying a rape case, in front of an Orthodox judge, Judge Altman, down in Manhattan Supreme Court, and we're doing jury selection. And I was actually doing jury selection for the jurors, and I asked them, "Are any of you Orthodox Jews or Seventh-day Adventists?" Because I know that they usually don't like to be on juries when there's only one witness, because Jewish law says you can't have one witness, you have to have two. So they're uncomfortable following American law. So I always have to ask them if they can do it. And the judge actually called me up and he's like, "I got a question for you." And I thought I was like in trouble or something, and he wanted to admonish me. And he goes, "I'm really curious." He was like, "How could you ever have someone be guilty under Jewish law for a rape case if you need two witnesses?" And I said, "I don't know." And he actually told me to go research it. And actually, in many parts of the Talmud, it's actually viewed as a property crime, not as a crime. And there are rules in the Talmud about like, how do you know if it's consensual or not? They talk about, did she cry out? Could you hear anything? So there actually are some factors. Was in the city, was in the field. But in general, it's talked about as a property crime, but I'm digressing a little bit. But anyway, again, fascinating story. You can make an argument they're all villains. You can make an argument there are some virtues and some heroes here. And there's just a lot here to talk about. And, so we'll take it from there. And I think you want to go on?
Yeah. So now we'll get to the third story. And we're going to actually talk about two stories here. We're going to talk a little bit about the story of Lot, in that there's some interesting parallels. So we're now in the book of Nevi'im, of the prophets. The specific book is Shoftim, Judges 2. These are the last chapters in Judges. And this is absolutely, without a question, without a doubt, the most horrific story in the Tanakh. Doesn't get worse than this. You're going to hear it. If you're not willing to hear some awful things,
R-rated.
Yeah, maybe even X-rated.
Maybe an X-rated.
Yeah, just shut off the Zoom right now, because it's awful. I mean, one of the interesting parallels that I did notice is that when you look at the parallel story in Lot, it also happens to be chapter 19. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe it's purposeful. I don't know. But the chapter in Lot that we're going to talk about is the famous story of Sodom and when Lot, Abraham's nephew, is visited by angels who advise him to leave because they're going to destroy the entire community. And we'll come back to that. But we're going to start with a story. The story is known as the Pilegesh. Pilegesh is a concubine, Pilegesh of Givoah. And so I'm going to read the text. In those days, and it's interesting how it begins. In those days when there was no king in Israel, key sentence. Right. It's at the beginning, and you'll see it's there again at the end. And it really explains why the story is happening. A Levite residing at the other end of the hill country of Ephraim, one of the tribes, took himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And what's interesting in this story is nobody is named. If you notice, everything else we read, everyone's got a name.
Which is really unusual.
Right. The good guys have names, the bad guys have names, their kids are named, their grandkids are, everyone's named. In this case, there is no name. It is just a Levite. And the fact that it's a Levite, from the priestly tribe, is completely relevant, right? So, he's a Levite living somewhere, actually, that scholars say right by Jerusalem, takes himself a concubine. It's interesting, it's not a wife, it's a concubine. Although you'll see later he's referred to as a husband. Concubine deserts him, leaves him for her father's house in Bethlehem, in the tribe of Judah, and she stayed there for a full 4 months. He's not happy about his concubine having disappeared on him, and he sets out with his servant and a pair of donkeys and went after to woo her. It says to woo her and win her back. She allowed him into her father's house. When the girl's father saw him, he received him warmly. And again, the father doesn't have a name, but the father-in-law, the girl's father, pressed him, and he says, stay with me for 3 days. We're going to eat, we're going to drink, you can sleep. And on the morning of the 4th day, he wanted to leave, but the girl's father said, no, you need more strength, eat more. I mean, talk about a Jewish in-law. Then you could leave. So the two of them sat down, they feasted again together. The girl's father said to the man, come on, stay overnight, let's have a party, let's have a good time. And the man's like, you know what? I've had enough. I got to get home. Father-in-law kept urging him until he turned back and spent one more night here. So think about this. He's just had this. He's got a concubine. It's not a wife, it's a concubine. The father of the concubine treats him warmly. It's never clear that she actually wants to go back to him. But early in the morning of the 5th day, he's about to leave. The girl's father tries again to get him to stay. And finally the man says, no, I've had enough of your entertainment. I want to go home. And the man has just been treated so well by the father of the concubine, takes the concubine and his attendant, and he leaves towards the end of the day. And the father warns him. He says, you know what? It's getting late. Make sure to stop for the night, have a rest. You can start early tomorrow on your journey and head home. But the man didn't want to do that. He wanted to leave, and he set out, and he traveled as far as an area called Jebus, which at the time is not a Jewish place. It's not one of the 12 tribes. And he's there with his donkeys and his concubine, and they were close to Jebus. They had gone far, and the attendant said to his master, let's go into this town of Jebusites. Let's spend the night here. We're tired. Time for bed. Master said to him, no, this is a town of aliens. These aren't our people. These are not Jews. We got to be with one of the 12 tribes. We're going to continue to Gibeah. He said, come to his attendant, let us approach one of those places, spend the night. So they traveled on, and the sun set when they were near this town of Gibeah, part of the tribe of Benjamin. They turned off there. They went to spend the night in Gibeah. They go to the center of the town square, waiting for someone to invite them to come and stay with us, right? These are their kin. They're all part of the 12 tribes of Israel. No one came. Finally, as evening, one old man comes from his property. He actually hailed from Ephraim, not from Benjamin. And he says, come, stay with us. Where did you come from? The man replies, we're traveling from Bethlehem in Judah. I was in Bethlehem. Now I'm on my way back to the house of the Lord. I'm a priest. But no one, even though I'm a priest and I'm on my way back to the house of the Lord, no one's taken me indoors.
See, this already reads like a horror movie, though. Like something's wrong here, right? He says we have to go to where our home team is, to our people, but then nobody wants to.
Nobody wants
like
to.
It reads wrong.
So the man says, rest easy. Let me take care of your needs. Don't spend the night in the square. You can come to my house. And he makes fodder for the donkeys. So the donkeys are going to bathe the feet of the man. They're enjoying themselves. And all of a sudden, the men of the town, a depraved lot, had gathered about the house and started pounding on the door. They called to the age owner of the house, bring out the man who has come into your house so that we can be intimate with him. They want to rape the man who is, a fellow tribesman from a different tribe who's a visitor in their town. Now, let's just jump quickly to the story of Lot, right? Remember, we're talking about Sodom, right? The worst people. There's not,
the paradise.
Right. You remember Abraham and God arguing about whether God should destroy Sodom. And he said, if there are 50, if there are 30, if there are 10, if there's even one good person. And in Sodom, there's not one good person. And take a look. So the angels come to see him. And where is it? They had not yet lain down when the townspeople, the men of Sodom, young and old, all the people to the last man gathered about the house, and they shouted to Lot and said to him, "Who are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may be intimate with them."
Sound familiar?
Sound familiar? Amazing, right? Like it's a complete
So it
parallel.
means the other guy is now essentially in the equivalent of stone.
Right.
Right. The Levite is now in stone, or the equivalent.
Right. So just showing you how bad these people are. And so
When we left them, they were banging on the door.
right. Where are we? Father, right. So the man says, "Hey, listen, this is the old man who took them in. I've got my virgin daughter here, and I've got this guy's concubine. How about we give them to you?" Which is the same thing that Lot said. You can have pleasure for them, do what you like, but don't rape the man. The men did not listen to him. They did not accept that deal. So the man took his concubine and he pushed her out. And they raped her and abused her all night long until morning. And they let her go when dawn broke.
It's hard to even read it out loud, isn't it?
It's horrible.
It's hard to even read out loud.
Horrible.
Yeah.
Towards the morning, the woman came back. And as it was growing light, she collapsed at the entrance of the man's house where the husband was. Her husband woke up. He had a nice sleep. He didn't get raped. She did. He opened the doors of the house, went out to continue his journey. And there was the woman, his concubine, whose father's house he just spent 5 days being taken care of, lying at the entrance of their house with her hands on the threshold. She barely got there. What does he do? Does he help her up? Is he in a panic? What does he do? He says, "Get up, let us go." She didn't reply. Was she dead yet? It's not clear. The man placed her on the donkey and set for home. When he got home, he picked up a knife and he took hold of his concubine and he cut her up limb by limb into 12 parts. And he sent each limb throughout the territory of Israel. And everyone who thought it cried out, "Never has such a thing happened or been seen from the day the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt to this day." Horrible story. A piece of this woman sent to every tribe in Israel. Now there's this whole thing that we're not going to get into because of the time of the revenge that the rest of the tribes take on the Benjaminites, where they kill almost everyone to the point that Benjamin is about to disappear. For the tribe of Benjamin is about to disappear from Israel. And then they find 400 women, non-Jewish women who can, or find not men who can have children with the women to make sure that Benjamin doesn't disappear from the earth. But thousands and thousands of people die in this battle. It's a horrible battle. You feel bad for the Benjamites, despite what people of Gibeah died. Nobody comes out good. And so we go to the end of the story, and what does it say? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did as he pleased. And so what is the point of this story at the end of Judges, the book of Shoftim in Nevi'im? And I think the lesson here is the importance of government as leadership. And that's what they're trying to tell us. When you think of where we first learned of Shoftim, of Judges, it was, Moses was like a king. He was a singular leader, very important, obviously led the people out of Egypt, but he tried to do everything himself. And in the Parsha Yitro, we learn that Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, taught him the importance of delegation, of creating judges and delegating authority, because that's how government has to work. And I think this is the next chapter, that's not enough. You need to have a proper government, a proper executive, strong leadership, and laws that will govern and make sure that people don't go down to their base instincts, but learn to respect law and morality. And I think that's what the story is about. It's a horrible story. And truth be told, I didn't learn it till I was in my Western class 3 years ago. And again, couldn't believe that it's actually there. But I think it's a wonderful, ugly, and very important story. Teaches you about base instincts and about leadership.
Yeah, so just a couple of things. So I discussed this with my sister over as a Bible professor, and her first reaction was, "Oh, the Peleg story." She said that is the single hardest story for me to get anything positive out of. And my father actually said the same thing, which is sort of a reaction to how horrible this is. I think that Jeff touched on is such a, and again, we got to give credit to our friend and teacher David Hoppins. I had never heard that. I don't know if you had heard it, but the comparison to Sodom and Gomorrah and the exact same pasuk, I had never heard that before. That was very new to me until 3 days ago. Which is it's such an amazing metaphor to say this is it was essentially Sodom and Gomorrah, which has become the metaphor for evil. But it's such a great way to read this because pasuk 25 doesn't fit. You have a narrative, right? You have the story, you have this horrible beginning, you have this battle, and then all of a sudden, read that pasuk. It's like in those days there was a king, everything's like please, like it doesn't fit. So it makes you ask yourself, like, why is it there? Otherwise, it doesn't make it's like it's almost begging you to ask the question. And so what Jeff just said is such a great way of looking at it, which is they almost needed a story this horrible to tee up the king, to tee up the next way of leadership. Because if it wasn't this horrible, I'm not sure it would be as powerful as a way to say, this is the time we're going to have change. Like, look how bad it's gotten.
And by the way, when I learned, I remember learning this in day school. I remember not this story. I remember learning about the Jews wanting a king, needing a king, which we start in this is the end of the book of Judges. We go to Samuel, and that's when the Jews demand a king, and they eventually get Saul. But we learned it as what they were at. They shouldn't need it. They have God as their king. And I think the point of this story is actually God is not our king. We need men. We need leadership who are men, right? We have the Torah, we have the laws, but it's not enough. We need government, we need laws, we need administration. It's a king here, it's a prime minister or a president.
Structure.
You need structure.
And society.
And so this is teaching you it's not all God, right? To quote the Talmud,
Right.
Lo b'shamayim hi, right? It's not, God gives us the Torah, then it's up to us. And I think that's a great lesson that I really wish more people learn.
And the whole part about how the father-in-law won't let him leave is almost such an interesting moment too, because it doesn't make sense. Why does he keep saying to him, is he lonely? Or maybe that's a way of saying that's the ultimate in hospitality.
Right. I think
almost like the opposite of how they're treated in the next town, because he won't let him leave and he wants him to eat and he wants him to stay.
Right.
So that's another interesting.
But I think, and it's also interesting, he's doing that to someone who's taking his daughter as a concubine, not as a wife. Why didn't he marry her? Why did they make it a concubine? Again, it's about not respecting women. It's showing how everything in the story is negative.
Right. Everything's horrible.
Everything's horrible. And that's what you're supposed to take from it. So Sarah, I think if anybody's got questions, we've been
through a lot of
comments to talk about.
A lot of interesting comments, and I'm going to read through them, and then if something sort of brings up something additional for you, please feel free to jump in. Okay, so Ellen says God doesn't really want to give them a king, but agrees to the requests of the people. The king write his own copy of Torah and carry it with him. Next, Molly says the beginning of the story. Sorry, wait, I'm scrolling through. The beginning of the story also reports that there is no leadership, lawlessness in that situation. These horrors can happen. Molly Ann also says, thank you for pointing out the Dina story. That is also a lesson in how to look after your sister. I think one of the questions that keeps coming up is, do you have a sense if day school education has changed since your child to include more of these complex stories?
So what I'd say, our kids are at Heschel, is there's more exegesis, there's more depth to the characters, and they really do push the kids. I don't, and Heschel's different from other day schools. I don't think they're teaching the rape of Dinah, the story of Tamar, and the Peleg of Gibeah.
Yeah, I would agree with Justin. I think it's more interesting, it's more nuanced, it's definitely more complex than what we had, but I don't think anyone's teaching this. And I mean, it's a separate discussion. Should they be, at what age would you teach this stuff? Because it's very problematic. I'd leave that to the professional educators, but I don't think anyone is teaching this.
Do you think that there's a sense of betrayal when, like, later in Jewish education, you come across these stories and that you realize that you hadn't learned them earlier?
I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't take betrayal. I would say, I think what I would say is I think there's value to it. I think, one thing I was thinking about when I was reading this is the great educator, Janusz Korczak, wrote a famous essay where he said he always thought it was great that there were no pictures of Moses, so that we could picture him in our own minds. And he wrote how because if Moses was perfect, or any of them were perfect, we wouldn't be able to compare ourselves to them.
Charlton Heston.
It's after he died. He was in World War II. And I thought, like, that was sort of interesting. Like, I always think the fact that and that's kind of what I was fighting about with those guys at the Beit Din, at least, and this is just me personally now. I don't know if you agree with this, but the fact that I think it's such a powerful statement that the avot and are flawed and problematic, and they're not perfect, and there's lots of problems, makes it more interesting and more richer to analyze the books for lessons we can learn for ourselves. I mean, that's how I feel. I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And your word betrayal, Sarah, is interesting. It's not that we didn't learn the stories that I found as a betrayal. It's the teachers trying to teach us that everything is perfect. People were perfect. That I felt was a betrayal as I learned this. They tried to give us this cleansed view of the Torah and of Judaism that isn't really there. And it's almost like a brainwashing technique.
Right.
That one essay I found that talked about this is the Dinah story as brothers and looking out for sisters, did talk about evolution. I already say, like, look at the difference. Like, the father is Jacob's older, and his reaction is, how am I going to be? I'm going to be a pariah. It's going to affect me and my standing in the community. He doesn't think about his daughter in that sense, but the brothers do. They don't just want property. They also want to avenge her, so they care about her as a person. And in this one essay, this person said, that's already an evolution. So maybe
it's like a generationally,
thing. It's already, even in the Bible, it's already getting more modern. So it was really interesting. Yeah. And I never learned that until I read that. But that was actually pretty cool. So it keeps evolving.
And the other thing Moshe and I spoke about earlier that is interesting is that, these three stories, and then there are other ones that we talked about. Like, we certainly had no idea when we learned the story of Avraham with Elimelech, that Avraham basically said, let's tell everyone, he says to Sarah, let's tell everyone you're my sister, essentially, so they can sleep with her, right? We didn't realize, we didn't learn that. We had no idea that was the rationale. I think a lot of these stories about how poorly men treated women, I think there'd be value in kids learning about it to understand more about right and wrong among the sexes.
Especially, and it also just shows, how modern it is. Look, we're still struggling with these issues now. Obviously, right? That's not what we're here to talk about, but you can still use these stories to learn from modern day times in terms of gender issues and, power, Me Too, whatever. It's amazing how current it all is. So I think there's clearly value. I think we all feel that way.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Sarah.
No, I'm just thinking, somebody got this as their Torah portion. Somebody, had to contend with this story, that week in synagogue. I'm curious also how rabbis, wrote their sermons that week.
It's interesting. My bar mitzvah parsha was Kitetse, right? And there's a lot of really problematic stories in Kitetse. That's the one where a man should not lie with another man. They talk about prohibition on cross-dressing. And I remember learning it and reading it, no one ever talked to me about it.
Right.
No one ever, and I think today, I think that's less true. I think, certainly, I went through some really difficult stuff with my son Benjamin when we were preparing his bar mitzvah, and he was working on his Dvar Torah, and there's some, again, really problematic stuff. I think today we are, and maybe it's because we're more liberal Jews than we were then. We're more willing to talk about the really difficult things in the Torah that don't necessarily apply to today, right? There are look, we don't believe in capital punishment. Even in rabbinic times, they really made it impossible to punish a capital crime with death.
So there was one question someone has posted saying, can we address the massacre aspect of the collective guilt? Yeah, there's a lot of commentators who talk about it was inappropriate that they essentially gave out collective justice. One person did something to his sister and they attacked the whole tribe. And there's definitely, Rashi talks about it, Rambam talks about it. They talk about was that appropriate, was it not? There's definitely commentators who say it was wrong, but there's definitely some that also say this was peoplehood. And they were basically saying, you mess with us, we're going to mess with you. And they made it tribal. And that's why that one commentator said, this could be the first moment there is an a Jewish people, because they acted as a tribe arguably for the first time. It doesn't make it right. It just makes it a different way of looking at it. But it's certainly a good question because it's certainly a complex part of the story.
And listen, we're winding down the night now. So I just want to, first of all, thank you, Sarah, for the wonderful job you did organizing this whole tikkun. I mean, the sessions, we've been going all night. It was just fantastic. Joy, if you're listening, thank you so much. You've created a wonderful institution. I'm so honored to be able to name it in memory of my brother, Paul. And I just want to say, and Paula would completely agree with me. I mean, Paul would love the tikkun for sure, but Paul loved blood gore. He would have loved learning about these that he went to day school and he didn't learn about either. And so, it's a really nice way for me to finish in memory of my dear brother who died just so young. Something that he would have loved and enjoyed and been talking about for a long time after. So,
and just to add to that real quick is I was talking to my father's a rabbi in New Jersey, and he said something interesting today. He said, he said Shavuot used to be the forgotten holiday, and he told me how they invented what was called confirmation. I don't know how people know what that is, but it was like a graduation for Hebrew school, and it was a fictional thing. They invented it because nobody came to shul on Shavuot. There was nothing, so they literally invented it. So what was he said to me? It's amazing what you have all, the JCC, Jeff, Paula have created. He said the fact that hundreds of people, I think we're probably over thousands, whatever it is, get together in Shavuot. Now, he said, you have recreated Shavuot. And he was telling me how it was for him such an amazing accomplishment because he lived through the times when they had to try to get a minyan because there was no ritual. So again, kavod to JCC, to Jeff, to Paul, to everything.
And the last thing, I get to say the last word, and so I just want to thank Moshe, not just for doing this, and this was fun. But the truth is, when at some point he had said to me, we went to the first tikkun we went to, the first JCC we went together. It was the year I moved back from London. My son had just been born. We didn't know what to do. We went to the tikkun, and it blew us away. And at some point, he made a comment. He said, if I could give money to anything, I would want to make sure this tikkun continued. And so when Michelle and I were hosting White Hot, I made a deal with Joy and with Hillel saying, listen, any money I raise above whatever we made last year, I want you to put towards the tikkun so we can.
It worked out well for me. Donate all your money.
and so, Michelle and I, we were fortunate that we had a lot of friends. We raised a ton of money, and so this tikkun has been named ever since then in memory of my brother Paul. My mom has come, my dad has come, Paula has come, and we all get a lot of real nachas, being able to do this in Paul's name.
And next year we bake cookies in person.
Yeah, and by the way, 2 years ago, Moshe and I baked
1,300
cookies. You can read about it in the Jewish Week if you search Moshe Horn, Jeff Feig, and cookies. We want to do it again.
Absolutely.
God willing, Yitzhak Hashem, we're all there in person. Chag Sameach.
Chag
Next year
Sameach.
in
Thanks for
person.
joining
Chag
us.
Sameach.
There'll be
Thank you
10 people
so
here, so
much.
thank you.